Good morning, welcome everybody. My name's Janie Murphy and I'm here to run through an email session with you. Email can't live without it, so how do you live with it? You should have a handout. I think I managed to get one of those to everyone as I walked around. So you don't need to take any notes, but if you kind of learn best by taking notes, then obviously feel free to do so. I want to start by asking a question. Hands up if you don't receive enough email and you would really love to receive more. Anyone putting those hands up? No, of course. I think we'd all agree that we receive too much email. In fact, email really is our dominant business communication tool. We use it for between 60 to 80% of all our business communication. Now, I don't think I'm telling you anything that you don't already know there, but I actually find that fact really interesting because there are a suite of tools out there, digital and otherwise, that we could use. Now, you may be familiar with those, you may not. Some you may have access to, some you may not, but they're there and they exist and they all suit a particular type of communication. Yet despite that, email is our go-to tool. So clearly we love email, or do we? I think for many people email is a double-edged sword. There are things that we really like about email, and then there are the things that drive us crazy. And when we fail to use and manage email well, it can result in some significant issues. And these sorts of issues cause massive loss of productivity, massive loss of time, not to mention the associated stress. So I'm wondering how effective you are at the moment at managing your email. Inside your little information pack, you'll find a sheet. How effective are you at managing your email? I'll give you a couple of minutes to read through each of those 8 statements and tick the most appropriate box, either always, frequently, sometimes, or never. And when you've done that, I'll put up a slide that will show you how to score yourself. Okay, to score yourself, on the slide, 3 points for always, 2 for frequently, 1 for sometimes, and 0 for never. Have we all got a total? Yep. All right, here's how it pans out. Now, before I put this up, I want to let you know that you're being measured against what are commonly considered to be best practice processes for managing your email. So some of you may actually get a score that you feel doesn't reflect your ability to manage your email. You feel like you're doing better than your score indicates. And if that happens to you, I'd suggest that sometimes it's just a case of you don't know what you don't know, and wait until the end of the session and see if your score makes a little bit more sense. So, if you scored between 0 to 5, you'd be considered to be highly effective in terms of the way you manage your email. Between 6 to 10, you're still doing pretty well, but if we tweaked a couple of your behaviours, you'd get some real productivity improvements. Between 11 to 15, you would be considered to be struggling when we measure your email behaviour against best practice processes. And on the downside of that, help is required, and I'd like to think that you're going to get some help in this session this morning. So is anyone a bit surprised? Or you feeling like, yeah? And I completely understand that, Holly. So,
sort of, but not really.
Sort of, but not really. Okay. Okay, all right. So wait until the end of the session and see if what we cover makes a little bit more sense to you. So in the area of email, people constantly struggle with volume, managing the volume. And the bad news is in that area, email volume is predicted to increase year on year. That's according to the Radicati Group, and it will be at around about 11 to 12% per annum. So you will receive more email next year than you are currently receiving this year. Now again, according to the Radicati Group, what that looks like for the average daily user, or the average business user, on a daily basis, is around about 84 incoming emails every day and 41 outgoing emails every day. Now you may receive less than that, you may receive more than that. The point to consider is that it's not actually the number of emails that you receive that causes the problem. If you received 84 emails every day and all you had to do was read them, it wouldn't be a drama. It would just be quite boring, but not a drama. It's the work you have to do as a result of receiving the emails. So good email management is actually about good workload management. So this morning we're going to look at fighting what I call the 4 vices of email. Now as we go through the session, towards the end there will be a time when you can ask questions, but I'm actually quite happy to take questions on the way through, so please feel free to ask them as they occur to you. If I say something that you violently disagree with, please let me know and we'll have a discussion about it. If it looks like we're going to get sort of too many, then we might have to pull back and just hold them till the end. So let's deal with the first vice, which is, not surprisingly, overwhelming volume. What can you do to deal with the overwhelming volume that comes into your inbox every day? I'm going to talk about 3 things in this section, and the first thing is you really need to make sure that you're only using email if it's actually the right tool for the job. It's not always email. Email is not the perfect business communication tool. It's only suited to a certain type of business communication. Now, if we lived in a perfect world, we would only use email when we needed to address a simple issue that involved a limited number of people where there was minimal collaboration required. That is ideally what email is suited for. Simple issue, limited people, minimal collaboration. Because email is an asynchronous communication tool. I email you, and at some later point in time, you email me back. Now, we use email way outside those boundaries. We use email to address really complex issues, sometimes of a quite sensitive nature, involving a lot of people where we need to collaborate. And that's where we can really get into trouble with email. Because an email is just words on paper, completely open to the interpretation of the person receiving the email. So I know we're not going to live in a perfect world ever, but it would be really good if we could try and get a little bit closer to only using email for simple issues, for a limited number of people with minimal collaboration. The second point to help with volume is to stop unnecessary emails. And I'm going to talk about 4 types of unnecessary emails. The first type is acknowledgement replies. So these are those emails that you send within your team or within your organisation that might just say thanks or okay. We've got to ask ourselves, are they really necessary? So if you can set a guideline, so you have the discussion with your team members and say, look, when we send an FYI email, it's purely information only. There is no need for anyone to respond saying thanks and okay. And to really assist that, a great practice is to adopt the process of putting in the subject line at the end of the subject, no reply necessary. So that just lets everyone know for those information only emails, you do not need to come back with thanks and okay. The second type of unnecessary emails is that reply to all, or the overuse of reply to all. And I'm sure you've all been in the situation where you've been sent an email, you're one of a number of people that have received that email, you're asked for your feedback, you dutifully send your feedback back to the sender of the email, and before you know it, you're inundated with everybody's feedback. Do you need to see that? Perhaps you do, perhaps you don't. It's actually best for the sender to decide that. So the process I'd recommend, again within your teams, is that you establish a bit of a guideline. You only use reply to all if the sender requests it. If the sender doesn't say, please reply to all, then you just send your response straight back to the sender of the email. That would cut down on an enormous number of emails within organisations. The third one, a little bit similar, irrelevant CCs. So again, this is a habit that can become embedded in an organisation where the tendency is every time an email is sent, everyone that has anything possibly to do with what the email is about is CC'd in on the email. And again, it's another significant contributor to excessive volume. The little rule that I like to adopt is I'll only CC someone if they need to see the email in order to do their job. If they need to see the email in order to do their job. If that's not the case, then no CCing. And the fourth and final one is a personal favourite of mine, read receipts. You know that little dialogue box that pops up on the screen that says so-and-so's requested a read receipt, do you want to send one now? Let me ask you a question. If that dialogue box pops up on the screen in front of you, how many people here click on no? That would be me. So that's interesting, isn't it? I'm quite surprised. Usually when I ask that question in workshops, if I ask that question of a large group of people, it's roughly about an 80-20 split, in that 80% of people will not send a read receipt, 20% of people will. So given those statistics, you're really not getting any value from your read receipt. So that's the first problem. But the second problem is that even if people do send a read receipt, it's no guarantee that the email has been read. It's a guarantee that the email has been opened, but not a guarantee that it's been read. So if you need to know that someone's read the email, you're better off to ask in the body of the email, please send me a quick reply when you're across this information, or something similar to that, but ask for what you want rather than relying on that read receipt. The third area within volume that can really help, and this is a feature that's built into most email programs, and Outlook in particular handles this really, really well, is using rules. Using rules in a particular way. Setting up rules to filter out of your inbox those sorts of emails that you really don't need to see when they arrive in your inbox. They're low priority emails, and they're emails that never ever require action from you. So I'm talking about newsletters, professional bulletins, maybe some system generated messages. You know the sorts of emails I mean? And they come in and they clog up your inbox, and yeah, sure, you like to read them, but you could read them in a few days' time, or maybe you might not get around to reading them at all. It doesn't really matter. In Outlook in particular, it's quite simple to set up rules to automatically move those emails out of your inbox the minute they hit the inbox and off into a separate folder. And I would suggest that everyone has a reading folder. So all of these types of emails go into your reading folder. And then in your calendar, maybe once a week or twice a week or whatever frequency you need, you block out some time to prompt you to go to your reading folder and have a quick look and see what's in there. Now, you do have the steps for setting up a rule on the back of the little handout there. So that's something I really recommend that you think about. Look at the types of emails you receive into your inbox and look at which ones are low priority, never need action, and then look to setting up your rules to automatically filter those out of your inbox. So there we have 3 techniques there that will help you reduce that incoming volume. The second vice is I for interruptions, the constant beep that you hear every time you receive a new email, or that little alert that slides up in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. It costs 64 seconds of your time every time Outlook beeps at you. That's according to research by Dr. Thomas Jackson, who's based at a university in the UK. Now, according to his research, if you're walking away and you're completely absorbed in what you're doing, and you hear that beep of a new email, or perhaps out of the corner of your eye you notice that desktop alert's lining up, and you're momentarily distracted, so you literally do that before you come back and refocus on the task at hand. According to Dr. Jackson's research, it takes 64 seconds to get your mind back to the place that it was before the interruption occurred. Now that's a pretty tiny chunk of time, but if you're doing that 10 times a day or 20 times a day, it gets to be a little bit more significant. And that's just the first scenario. The second scenario is the 4-minute scenario, and you will recognise this. You're working away and you're completely absorbed in what you're doing. You hear that beep of a new email, so you're distracted. You read either the desktop alert or perhaps the email staring you in the face in your reading pane, so you look at the subject and you think, I'll read that email, and you scan the email, because we always scan emails when we read them, and on average it takes 2 to 3 minutes to scan an email. You decide not to do anything about it and you refocus back on the task at hand. So 2 to 3 minutes to scan the email, 64 seconds to refocus, there's your 4 minutes. What did you achieve in those 4 minutes? Absolutely nothing. The third scenario came out of Microsoft themselves. They studied a group of workers in one of their office locations over a 2-week period. This is the 25-minute scenario. So what they observed happening with this particular group of workers was something along these lines. People would be working away completely absorbed in what they're doing. Hear that beep of a new email, or out of the corner of their eye, notice that desktop alert sliding up. Distraction, read the email. The email might contain some links to a couple of websites. So off to the websites to look at the information. Find some information that could be of value to a colleague. So back to the inbox, send an email to the colleague. Back to the inbox again. Big long list of emails in the inbox. Some have been read, some haven't been read, some have been read and perhaps rebolded again to remind them they need to follow up on them. So reread a few of those emails for the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th time, still not do anything about them, and so on and so on and so on. Now, on average, for this particular group of workers, it was 25 minutes before they returned to the original task. Was that the best use of those 25 minutes? Probably not. And why did it happen? It happened because of a beep. If we look at the cost of just that 64-second loss of time in a team of people, let's say we've got 25 people in a team. with a fairly low incoming daily volume of 30 emails a day. Now, I'm going to be really generous and say that only half of those emails cause that 64-second distraction. That means that each person in that team is losing 16 minutes a day. But the team is losing 6.6 hours a day. Now, across a year, that is 213 days of lost productivity. That is insane, all because of a beep. If you are responding every time Outlook beeps at you, who is in control? You or Outlook? Outlook. Outlook's got you doing what it wants you to do or when it wants you to do it. So rather than experience that kind of productivity loss, what we want, best practice, is silent email. No visible or audible notification. Now, there would be one exception to this. That would be anyone whose role is frontline customer support, a help desk type situation, if you like, where their role is to respond to any problems or issues that arrive from clients and customers, and they come via email. In that kind of role, then this would be entirely inappropriate. But if that's not your role, then silent email. We really need to remember that email's not our work. It's just the way that our work comes to us. So if we're not checking each email as it arrives, when do you check your email? Well, best practice is that you process, and I deliberately use the word process, you process your email 3 to 4 times a day at regular intervals at times of your choosing. Now, if you feel you really need to check more than 3 to 4 times a day, you'd really like to do 5 or 6 email checks, I don't have a problem with that. The point is you have to decide, not let email decide for you. Now, that first email check might look a little bit late depending on what time you start. What sorts of times do you start?
7.
7? Yeah, anyone start 7:30, 8? So you've all got varying starting times, but most people tend to have the same set of habits when they first arrive in at the office. You may have already looked at your email on a mobile device of some kind before you leave home or on a commute. If you commute to work, that's absolutely fine. But most people, when they get to the office, will do something like this. You'll come in and you'll put your things down on your desk. You'll switch your PC on, always takes a few minutes for that login screen to come up. While that's happening, you might go off and get a tea, a coffee, a glass of water, you'll have a chat to a few colleagues, you'll come back, you'll sit down, you'll log in. What's the first program that you run? Outlook. What's the first screen that comes up inside Outlook? Your inbox. Oh, well done, Janetta. Okay. Mostly it's the inbox. And what's the first thing that you do?
Start looking at your email.
You start checking your email. Of course you do. Everyone does, don't they? And how do you feel at the end of that email check? Are you feeling like, yeehaw, bring on the day? I'm feeling pretty excited and I'm feeling really enthused. Does anyone feel like that typically after they've checked their email? Depends on what's in the email.
Coffee, I think.
Sorry?
It depends what's in your coffee.
Could be. Here's the thing. When you start your day by doing an email check first thing, what you're really doing is starting your day working to someone else's agenda. Now, I don't think there's anyone in this room that when you left work the night before, you had cleared every single thing off your to-do list. There was absolutely no outstanding tasks for you to do. No, I didn't think there would be. So if that's the case, a much better practice would be when you get in the next morning to start your day by dealing with your own work. Tick a couple of things off your own task list first before you go in and check your email. So the idea is to keep the first hour or even the first half an hour, make that an email-free zone and get on with your work, because email's not your work. It's just the way that your work comes to you. And once you've achieved something, you'll start the day feeling in control. You'll feel productive because you've already ticked a couple of things off your to-do list. Then go in and do your first email check. And you'll find it's just a completely different way to start your day. It's quite a small change in habit because the only thing you need to change is this. You still come in and put your things down and switch your PC on and do your tea, coffee, glass of water, have a chat, come back, sit down, log in, still run Outlook, but change what's called the startup folder in Outlook. Change it to your calendar. And that way your calendar screen comes up and you'll see that we can set up that calendar screen so it's a brilliant workload management screen. It not only shows you where you need to be, but it also shows you what you plan to do on that day. So it's quite easy for you to get on and be productive right from the very start of the day. Now again, you've got the steps for setting calendar as your startup folder on the back of your handout to get you going. We really need to get that focus off the inbox. It's a major source of distraction. So I'd suggest that you work from your calendar instead and use your calendar as your workload management screen. So there we have it in interruptions. The C. The C is for poor clarity. How you compose and how you structure your emails can have a massive impact on how the receiver then deals with them and when they deal with them and if they deal with them in a timely fashion. Interestingly, when someone reads an email, they'll take around about 2.7 seconds to assess whether they're going to deal with that email at that point in time. It's called the glimpse factor. And in that time, these sorts of questions are going through their head, and you'll recognise these because it's what goes through your head pretty typically when you first scan an email. You're asking yourself, have I got time to deal with this now? Can I get rid of this and not do anything at all about it? Or really, do I need to hold on to it and do something about it later? They're the sorts of questions that go through people's minds when they first scan an email in about 2.7 seconds. And the I pattern is something like this. The first thing that you look at if you open the email, similarly if you're reading it in the reading pane, you look at who the email's from. That's going to play a big impact or a big part on whether or not you're going to deal with that email. If you don't recognise the name of the sender, you'll look at the email address. So you're looking at the URL just to see if you recognise the company name. After that, you go to the subject line. So it's really the sender and the subject line that get your email opened. From the subject line, once you've checked that out, you look at the salutation or the greeting. You're looking to see if the email is addressed personally to you. If it's got a very generic greeting, it's looking like it's just a bit of a mail out or something, the tendency will be to move on to something else. Then you'll look at the perceived length of the email. You're checking to see whether you think it's going to be easy to deal with. From there, you tend to move down to the sign-off, possibly looking for any marketing hype, anything to indicate that this is not something that you really need to pay attention to right now before you come back and actually read the content of the email. So that's what we tend to do. Now, at any of those points, there's an opportunity for the recipient to opt out, to move on to something else. And the typical opt-out points are the subject, the greeting, and the perceived length. If those things are not right, people will lose interest and they'll move on to another email. Now, when that happens, when emails are not dealt with in a timely fashion because they're poorly structured and they don't feel like they're easy to deal with, there are some pretty significant costs to the organisation. So you know when you get that email that just looks like you open it up and your heart sinks. You go, oh my God, this is going to just take me forever to work out what's going on here. It takes you longer to get around to reading that email. You'll put that on the back burner. I'll come back to that and I'll deal with that later. I can't handle that now. Now, when you finally do get around to reading it, your response is going to be greatly delayed. And you might even need to send some clarifying questions in an email because you can't work out what's required of you. Now, all of that can potentially delay decision making in an organisation. So there are some really significant costs when we don't structure emails in a way that makes it easy for people to act on. And it all starts with your subject line. This is not rocket science. It really is the most important line in your email. Too often, unfortunately, it's the line that people fill in really quickly before they get to what they think is the most important part, which is the body of the email. Now, here's a tip for you. Always work in a new email from the bottom up, not the top down. So always start by writing the content of the email first. Once you've written the content of the email, it's easier to work out what an appropriate subject line would be and address it last. That saves the accidental click on send, but also if you do need to CC someone, it will be more apparent once you've actually written the email. Now your subject line, what should it look like? Well, there are 3 absolute musts and 1 kind of optional, if you like. So the 3 musts are descriptive, specific and concise. Your subject line must satisfy those 3 criteria. So it needs to accurately describe what the email's about, including enough information to distinguish that email from similar emails. So that means those subject lines like meeting just really don't cut it, like what meeting? But it still needs to be concise because people will read emails on handheld devices and they'll truncate subject lines. So a technique that can help overcome that is always front load your subject line. So put the important words at the beginning of the subject line rather than at the end, even if grammatically it doesn't read quite so well. The 4th one, this is optional. If any action's required, some people like to put that in the subject line. That's quite a good technique. It's not something I do personally, but it is quite a good technique. What I'd like to do now is put up some pairs of subject lines, and if you think about descriptive, specific and concise, I'd like you to tell me which you think is better, A or B. So which is better, A or B? Descriptive, specific, concise. Yep, B. You can see it's got the date, so it's more specific. You know exactly what team meeting is being talked about. Okay, next pair. A or B? B? B is absolutely fine, so is A in this example. The difference between the 2 is that in A you have action followed by object, in B you have object followed by action. Now if you worked in the contracts area, you probably would choose B because that's important to you. I think I went for A because I like please complete at the beginning, but I'm perfectly happy with B. Next pair, A or B? There is a specific problem with A. What's the problem with A?
This Friday. This Friday.
What problem does that cause?
You need to look at the date.
If you're away or something.
Friday.
Correct, yeah. It depends entirely upon when the person reads it as to how they interpret this Friday. So whenever you're going to use relative terms like this Friday or next Wednesday, even in the body of the email, it's a really good technique just to put the date in brackets. Make it easy for the person to know what day you're talking about because you actually don't know when they're going to read it. Okay, next pair. B, just more information, more specific. Next pair. Now I'll give you a clue here. EOM stands for end of message. So that effectively means that there's nothing in the body of the email. The subject itself is the message. Now that can work really well if, again, within your organisation or your team, you establish that as a guideline. So you come to an agreement. You say, look, if we've got a really short message to convey, we'll type it into the subject line and put EOM at the end. Now it saves the sender because the sender doesn't then have to, in the body of the email, put in a greeting, type up the message and put in a closing, and it saves the recipient, particularly if they don't use their reading pane, they don't have to open the email up only to find that there's nothing in it. But works best if you have an agreement, again, within your team. And the one that also works well at the end of the subject line, which I've already mentioned, is no reply necessary. That works really well also. Last pair. A or B? A? A is perfectly acceptable. It's descriptive, it's specific, and it's nice and concise. But if you were wanting to impel action, you actually want people to really take some action here, B would more likely get that action for you for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's asking a question. And a question is always engaging in a subject line. When people read a question, they cannot help but think about it. You might not want to think about it, but you can't help but think about it. And secondly, the subject line itself is personalised. It's talking to the recipient. Are you aware? The subject line is directly talking to that recipient. So for that reason, B, even though it's a bit wordier, it's not quite as concise, I would be going for B. Then you get 10 out of 10 for clarity if you focus on one purpose. So the rule of thumb is generally one topic or one subject, one topic, one email. So don't cover lots of different topics or subjects in the same email if they're not related. We get much clearer in our writing if we focus on one purpose. Keep it brief. No more than one screen load. If your email's going across a screen load, you need to think about either splitting it into a couple of emails or perhaps creating an attachment. Remember that perception when people open your email is really important as to whether they'll deal with it at the time they receive it. And finally, formatting. Formatting hugely important in an email in terms of how people perceive the email as to whether it's easy to deal with or not. So if you received that particular email, how would you feel about that?
Turn it off.
Yeah, you'd be going like, yeah, not dealing with that now, I'm going to move on to the next email. And yet, it's not overly long. It's a screen load long. It's only 3 paragraphs. What are the problems with that email in terms of formatting? What do you notice most? What leaps out at you? Needs more space. That is the main problem. It needs more space. And those paragraphs, they're really long, aren't they? It looks really wordy. So what we need to do is just use standard formatting techniques. So there's no rocket science here, and we can transform that email into that. Now, does that look like it's easier to deal with? So what are you noticing in terms of formatting? Headings, yep, headings great for breaking the content up. It allows the recipient also to read the email in the order that's important to them, so they can zoom in on the areas that are important to them. What else do you notice?
It's chunked, so you can focus on one
Yeah,
area at a time.
absolutely. We've got bullet points there for summarising information. If you've got an important point to make, it's a good idea to put it on a line on its own. Here. So that draws the eye. Every time you read that email, you'll be drawn to that single line. Notice the length of the paragraphs. They're short. I wouldn't take a paragraph across more than 3 lines. Any longer than 3 lines, once you get to that 4th line, it starts to look like it's too much text. And vary the length of your paragraphs. So mix it up. Have some that are a single line, some that are 2 lines, some that are 3 lines. It adds interest. It adds a layer of interest.
So just on that, if the email does have to go, the information does go above one page.
More than a screen, yep.
And you cannot chunk it in a way because there's information that you just have to communicate. Would it be then better to separate that in an attachment, in like a Word document, say see attached for more information, and really only focus on the important?
I would absolutely agree with that. So in a situation where the content of the email, it is quite long, it's going to scan across a page and you can't break those paragraphs up because the content needs to stay together, absolutely the way to go would be to keep your email brief, explain the attachment, summarise what the attachment's about, but then put the detail in the attachment. Most definitely. Yeah, excellent question. Then, in terms of how you present the content itself or the information, you need to use a structure called the journalistic triangle. The reason it's called the journalistic triangle is this. If you're reading a page on the newspaper, what would you read? What would grab your attention? A headline. You'd read a headline that grabbed your attention. If the headline grabbed your attention, how much of the article would you commit to reading? First paragraph, exactly. You don't read that headline and go, yeah, great, I'm interested, I'm reading that entire article. You go, no, that's an interesting headline, I'm going to read the first few lines, and if I'm still interested, I'll keep reading. If I'm not, I'm going to move on to something else. Well, that's what people do with emails. They read the first few lines in your email, and if you don't grab their attention, they're going to move on to something else. So you need to get that main point at the beginning of the email. It's also called the inverted triangle layout. Now, we tend not to do this. Our natural tendency is completely the opposite. We want to explain everything, give the reasoning, give the justification, and then tell them why we've written the email at the end of the email. Well, you're lucky if they get there. You need to flip that on its head and put the most important point right at the beginning of that email. Sometimes you might need to soften it a bit by using an introductory sentence, otherwise it might seem too abrupt, but it needs to come right near the beginning of the email. That brings us to the 4th vice, which is inefficient management. How you manage your incoming email is absolutely critical to your effectiveness and your efficiency. And the mistake that people make is they use their inbox as a task management area. So you accumulate emails in your inbox and you try and manage your tasks from there. And you'll do things like flagging emails and rebolding them to draw your attention to them. But the bad news is, I know. The bad news is the inbox lacks any of the necessary facilities for efficient task management. You can't prioritise, you can't reschedule. It simply is not designed to be a task management area. It's just a delivery point for your emails. And we need to really remember that. I don't think I've seen anyone walk up to their post office box or their letterbox, pull out all the envelopes, open up each envelope, pull out the letter, read it, shove it back in the envelope, and then shove them all back in the post office. But we wouldn't do that. That would be ridiculous. But we do it all the time with email. And that clutter is a massive distraction. Every time you go to your inbox to check new emails, if you've got existing emails in there, particularly if you've flagged them or rebolded them, you're going to be reading those emails again. You're still not going to do anything about them, but you're just going to reread them to refresh your memory as to what you need to do about them. A couple of habits you've got to establish if you want to get over this whole pattern. You need to get really used to touching an email once and dealing with it. So no more of this read it, come back, read it again and again and again because you can't work out what you need to do about it. And then the trick to really clearing out all of that clutter is to turn the email into what it is. So if we think about that for a moment, if you receive an email that requires you to take some kind of follow-up action, what would Outlook call that? It's got a folder for them. Tasks. If you receive an email that requires you to be somewhere on a certain date at a certain time, what would Outlook call that? An appointment. Now, they're the only two possibilities. If you've got to take some kind of action after receiving an email, it can only either be a task or an appointment. So using a simple drag and drop technique, we can turn an email into what it is, either a task or an appointment. So when I process my emails, because I want to clear all of that clutter out of my inbox, I use a very simple processing rule. I make a choice between doing the action and deferring the action. And how I choose is based on how long the action will take. If the action will only take me a couple of minutes, I do it there and then while I'm processing my emails. So it might be deleting it, filing it, quick reply, forwarding it on, make a quick phone call. I do it. And then I get rid of the email from my inbox. I either file it or I delete it. If, on the other hand, it's going to take me longer than 2 minutes, I'm not going to do that action while I'm processing my emails because I'm processing my emails. I'm going to defer it. I'm going to put it to a later date. And the way that I do that is by turning the email into what it is. So it becomes either a task or an appointment. And then it becomes a question of how I manage that work that I'm creating. Very, very simple way to empty your inbox. And then we need to get that focus on our work, not our email. So we need to get that list of tasks that we've created as a result of dragging emails and turning them into tasks. We need to get that visible. And using Outlook, it's a pretty simple process because you can set your calendar screen up in Outlook. So on the left-hand side, you have your time-activated commitments. And on the right-hand side, you can display what's called the to-do list. And the to-do list has an area where it shows you, the whole thing's called the to-do bar, and in the to-do list area it shows you the tasks you've yet to complete from your tasks folder. So that's the totality of your work on any given day, where you need to be and what you plan to do. Now, with a little bit of customising, we can get this task list area looking fantastic so that we've got a little checkbox that we tick off when we've done it. Oops. We set our priorities. If something's high priority, we can indicate that it is, and we have all of our tasks grouped by the date that we plan to do them. So there's the totality of your work on any given day. So thank you very much, everybody.
Authorised by the Government of Western Australia, Perth.